Well, today we are continuing in our series On the Road Again. And what we're doing in this series is we're talking about the journey of faith. That we all are on a journey when it comes to our relationship with God, and there's things we're learning along the way, there's questions that we have, there's doubts we have, there's struggles that we have. And we're looking into the story of the Bible to find men and women in the Old Testament, first part of the Bible, and New Testament, second part of the Bible, who responded in faith to God, who chose to begin a journey with Him. And we're looking at their lives as examples for our own journeys, what we can learn from them and the decisions they made and the struggles that they had, which are very similar to the ones that we have in our lives. Today, we're going to look at a really incredible story, a really interesting story in the Old Testament that's called Esther. It's found in a book that bears her name. Now, you might be familiar with this story. Maybe it's new, but it's a challenging story. And I find that there are a number of stories like this in the Bible, stories that are not necessarily so easy to deal with. You know, we talk oftentimes about the Bible being a book, and that's because it's kind of organized that way, but really the Bible is more like a library that contains all sorts of different texts within it. There's different genres of literature. There's over 40 different authors. We have a number of things happening, and you come to these places where you find stories and insights that will take some work to kind of figure out what's going on here. You know, one of the questions that I have been asked in my life a number of times is someone will come up to me and say, hey, I'm new to faith, or maybe I'm coming back to faith. What part of the Bible should I read? And I kind of have a similar answer that I give people, and you might have this as well, where I say, yeah, you want to start in the New Testament, go to one of the Gospels, the stories of Jesus, so read one of those Gospels. Maybe you read one of Paul's letters we have in the New Testament. If you want to go in the Old Testament, maybe check out the book of Psalms or read some of Israel's history. But there's certain books that I don't necessarily recommend jumping in. Like, I don't think I've ever said, oh, you're starting with the Bible? Revelation, great place to go. Jump in there, just get in the fire, it'll be good. It's great, but it's a little confusing. Also, I don't think I've ever said to someone, well, you're looking to spice up your devotional life, Song of Songs. Check that one out. If you don't know Song of Songs, it's a collection of love poetry in the Old Testament. It's a favorite of junior high boys. So a lot of interesting things happening in different parts of the Bible. And honestly, the book of Esther is kind of like that at times. What do we do with this story? Because when you approach the book of Esther, there are some really unique things that are happening within the story. For example, in Esther, God is never mentioned. You don't find the name of God. You don't find a title for God. We find this all throughout the Bible, different books in the Old Testament talk about God. In Esther, God is never mentioned. Also in the book of Esther, no prayers are offered. We know prayer is a big part of our spirituality and connecting with God, and in the story of Esther, you don't find anybody praying. There's no prayers that are written or recorded. And finally, in the book of Esther, God doesn't speak. In so many different stories in the Old Testament, we hear God give directions. A couple weeks ago, we talked about Abraham. His story in Genesis, God told Abraham what to do, where to go. Even last week in the New Testament, we were talking about Paul, the Apostle Paul, and he has this vision of Jesus, and Jesus says, Paul, stop doing what you're doing and do this instead. So he gives him direction. But in Esther, it seems like God is silent. That there's no direction, there's no insight. God seems kind of quiet. Now, these and other issues are part of the reason that we might struggle at times with this book. And historically, people have had different objections to Esther or didn't really know what to do with it. Martin Luther, the famous reformer, he didn't like Esther. Like, he struggled with what does this story do within kind of the whole story of the Bible. And yet, when we look at this incredible story, we see that there are some amazing examples of how God works in the world and how he works in our lives. I love this quote that Chuck Swindoll said. He's a pastor and a writer, and he was talking about the book of Esther, and he said this: though God may at times seem distant, and though he is invisible to us, he is always invincible. And that really is the key to understanding the story of Esther, that God might not be speaking in the ways that he does in other parts of the book. God might seem distant, yet he is at work, oftentimes in ways that we don't fully understand. So as we dive into this story today, we're going to see God's hand in so many different things that happen in the story of Esther. Now, the story of Esther is not a long story, but it's not short. It's 10 chapters. And we're going to look at kind of the main plot of the story, but really focus in on the main character, Esther. But in order to understand the story and really kind of appreciate what's happening, we have to know a little bit about the background and then also talk a little bit about these main characters. Now, the story of Esther you're going to find in the Old Testament, and it happened during a very difficult time in history for God's people. It happened during the time of exile. Now, before the story of Esther occurred, the nation of Israel had a civil war. and it was split into. I have a map here to show you. And when this happened, the nation divided, and the kingdom of the north became known as Israel. They hung on to that name. But in the south, they took on the name Judah. Now, when all this was taking place, God was very clear to his people that there was a danger of them being exiled, of them being defeated by foreign nations and powers. And it happened. In fact, Israel, the kingdom of the north, was the first to be exiled. And the nation of Assyria came in and they destroyed them, they conquered them, and they were exiled. Now, the southern kingdom, Judah, they hung on for a while longer. About 100 years or so, they were independent and they were doing all right, but eventually they were exiled too. But this time it was to the nation of Babylon. Babylon came in, and they were led by a very famous king in the Old Testament. His name's King Nebuchadnezzar, Old King Neb for short. He came in, led this revolt. People were exiled, and a number of people were taken from Judah, now living in Babylon. But then what happens, which is kind of interesting, is another super powerhouse arrives on the scene, the nation of Persia. And Persia defeats Babylon. And when this happens, it's actually a good thing because a number of the Jews are allowed to go back home, but a number of them are still living outside of their home in exile. And the story of Esther is this little slice of history of these Jews who were living in Persia under this foreign rule. So that's the context. That's the setting for the book. And now we have the main characters that emerge on the scene. And the first character, the most important character in the story, is, of course, Queen Esther. We're going to focus on Queen Esther in her story, her faith journey. But we have some other important characters too. The next one is a guy named Mordecai. Mordecai is related to Esther. He's like her uncle. And what has happened to Esther is her parents have both passed away. She's an orphan. And so Mordecai becomes a father figure to her. He adopts her, takes care of her. And in the story, he sort of acts like this guide for her and just is kind of there for her, supporting her and trying to help her in this position that she gets into as the queen. And then we have the other characters who are, well, they're not the good characters, okay? We have the king of Persia, who is known as Xerxes. That's his Greek name. Now, in your Bible, you might have his Hebrew name, which is Ahasuerus. Difficult to say, so we're going to call him Xerxes, okay? And then we have the villain in the story, and the villain is Haman. And like all good villains in any story, he has a plot where he's trying to bring about destruction, where he's trying to make his name great. And what Haman does, his plot, is what Esther responds to. So what Haman kind of initiates in this kingdom is what tests Esther's faith and gives her an opportunity to step into the story that God is writing. Now, I said Esther is 10 chapters, so it's kind of long, but it begins in chapter 1 with Xerxes, the king of Persia, and he's throwing a party. And we read that this is a great party, that he is having a party for like a week long. And at this party, as kings do, there's food, there's drinking, there's lots of merriment. And what King Xerxes does is he begins to be very prideful and boastful about who he is. Now, if you know anything kind of about like Xerxes historically, there's a lot written about him, that he had this really opulent kingdom. He was very powerful. I mean, it spread like for miles and miles. And so he is throwing this party to show how great he is. And then he has this idea at the party where he wants to show off to all the people there his beautiful wife. Now, his wife's name is Vashti. And so what Xerxes orders Vashti to do is to make an appearance at this party. And what he says to her is he wants her to come in wearing her crown. Now, the text isn't super clear exactly what he's saying here, but a lot of commentators think that what he was actually asking his queen to do, his wife to do, was basically to make a spectacle of herself, to stand there so that people could notice how beautiful she was. He was asking her to do this incredibly immodest thing. And what Vashti does, which is amazing, is she says no. She tells him, I'm not going to do that. You didn't say no to kings, but she stands up and she says she will not do this. I mean, that could be a sermon in and of itself, like her life and her story and what she does. Now, by refusing the king, what happens is, well, Xerxes gets really upset. And he decides to banish her. He decides that she's no longer going to be his queen. And then he goes on to write a law into the Persian world that says that no queen will ever disobey the king again. Spoiler alert, it happens, all right? So he comes up with his plan, like this will never happen again. And so that's where Queen Esther enters into the story, because now there's this vacancy for the queen, and Esther happens to be the one to fill that spot. So what Xerxes does in the story is he gathers all of the available women in his kingdom. And this is a lot of women that come to the palace, and he's going to pick the one that he likes the most. And there's sort of like this beauty pageant that takes place. And Esther is the one who's found to be worthy. In fact, we read this in Esther chapter 2, verse 15. Then Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. So she just stands above the rest, and she's now chosen to be the queen. So it really is kind of this incredible beginning to the story because she is living in this foreign land. She's Jewish, she's not from Persia, and yet she now is in this position of influence. She probably never could have imagined that that would happen. So they're celebrating Esther, celebrating her as queen, and the story begins really in this positive light. And then there's something else really interesting that happens in the very beginning of the story that has to do with Mordecai. So a few verses later, Mordecai is in the right place at the right time. We read this. During that time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, and Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, they became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. So two people figuring out, hey, we want to get rid of this king. Mordecai sees this. It continues. But Mordecai found out about the plot, and he told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. So Mordecai kind of minding his own business, doing his own thing. He hears about this plot to assassinate the king, and he says something to Esther. Now he has this direct connection to the king. She says something, and it stops. So it's really this incredible beginning to the story. It's sort of Cinderella-esque, right? I mean, Esther now is the queen from obscurity to fame. Mordecai is this man who's now honored. He's done this great thing. He's thinking to himself, man, my daughter, the person I love, she's going to be okay. She's now in this position of influence. This is all really, really good. And the story seems great. But then the villain enters the story, right? Which is what happens. Now, Haman, we're told in chapter 3 of Esther, he's made to be this official to the king. So he's kind of given this position of authority and power, basically like second in command. And Haman, like every sort of evil villain, lets all that power go to his head. And he's kind of this megalomaniac, and he begins to demand that people bow down to him and honor him. So he's just walking through the streets. He's like, I'm an important person. You need to bow down. You need to honor me. And he demands it. And so people are doing this. But there's one guy that won't bow down to him. And you can probably guess who that is. Mordecai. Mordecai's like, I'm not going to bow down to you. I'm a faithful man. I'm a Jewish man, and there's no idols before God. There's no way I'm going to do this. And that infuriates Haman. He gets really upset. And all of a sudden, Mordecai becomes just sort of his project is to end him. And there's actually a lot of subplots within the story of Esther, and one of them is that Haman is just really obsessed with trying to figure out how he's going to destroy Mordecai. And he goes to all these great lengths, and he comes up with even really cruel, unusual ways to die because he's just so upset at Mordecai. But he comes up with a really brilliant plan. And his plan is he's going to find a way to not only destroy and kill Mordecai, but to destroy everyone that's like Mordecai, so the Jews. And he knows that in order to do this, he has to get the king to sign off on it. So Haman goes to the king, and he has this plan that he shares with him. We see this in chapter 3. It says, Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. And then he says, it's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. Kind of trying to manipulate Xerxes a little bit here. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. So Haman has this plan. He goes to the king and he says, hey, there's this people, you don't really want them in your kingdom. They're not like everyone else. What can we do to get rid of them? And then he sweetens the deal a little bit and says, hey, if you're willing to do this, I'll make this donation into the treasury. So he bribes the king. What I find really interesting about that is this is a story from thousands of years ago, and I think sometimes there's this opinion that the Bible is not relevant to our lives or doesn't really speak to human nature, and yet we see that stuff all the time. In the world we live in, where power and corruption cause us to do things where people use money as a way to get what they want, and here in this story, that's exactly what Haman is doing. And so Xerxes, he signs off on this. Now, here's the important part to understand is that by issuing it as a decree and making it a law in this culture would have meant that it's a done deal. Once a law is in place, you can't undo it. So Haman knows if the king will sign off on it, it's going to happen. Now, Mordecai finds out about this. He finds out about this law that's been made. He finds out about what Haman's done. And there's this scene where Haman's walking by Mordecai, and you can almost just see Haman gloating, I got you. I figured it out. And Mordecai is distressed. And his response is he begins to mourn. He understands this means not only the end of his life, but the end of the life of all of his people. So he's outside the city gates and he's mourning and he's crying over this. He understands that they're not going to survive. Now, Esther, during this whole time this is happening, she has no idea that Haman's gone to the king. She doesn't understand what is being, decided upon, but she sees Mordecai. And she hears that her beloved, father is in mourning, and so she asks him about it. What's going on? And he tells her, this is the plan. This is what Haman is doing. This means the destruction. It means the end of us. This is a big deal. And then Mordecai says to Esther, you got to do something about it. You're the queen. You're in this position. You got to go to the king and you have to stop this from happening. You're the only one who can. Now, what Mordecai is asking Esther to do is not an easy thing. It's not just like a small favor. He's asking her to risk everything. He's asking her to risk her very life to do this. In fact, this is what she responds to him in the next passage. She says this, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So what Esther says is, it's not just an easy thing that you're asking me. You're asking me to go before the king. And guess what? If I do that without being summoned, that means I die. Now, we might read that and be like, Xerxes really needs to chill out a little bit. Like, somebody just going into his presence is like cause enough for them to die. Okay, this guy has a lot of issues, obviously. But that's what it meant in that kingdom. Esther's response is, don't you get it? Like, me going to him means my life might be over. Me going to him might mean it's like a suicide mission. I don't think I'm going to survive it. Do you understand what you're really asking me to do? And then Mordecai responds back to her. And his response is the most famous verse in the book of Esther. And he says this to her. He says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. See, Mordecai's response to Esther is that if you don't do anything, you're still in danger. See, one of the details of the story is that when Esther became queen, she never identified what her heritage was. She never said that she was Jewish. Mordecai told her not to. We're not really sure exactly why. Maybe he was sensing there was already some tensions in the kingdom, but she never said that. And Mordecai says, once they find out that you're Jewish, you're as good as dead too, because the law in the land is not going to be reversed. So Mordecai says to her, maybe you are in this position right now. Maybe you became queen for such a time as this, for this very moment where you are called to step in and do something on behalf of your people. Esther hears all of that, and her response is really beautiful. She says, I will go. I'll go to the king, even though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. She understands in this moment what is being asked of her, and she says, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go to this place, even though it might mean the end of me. I'm going to step in. I'm going to do the thing that seems impossible. I'm going to have courage and faith as I choose to do what's right, not just what's easy. It's an incredible thing. And this choice that Esther makes right here, this choice to go, this choice to face off against the king, is what influences the rest of the story of Esther. Everything changes from this moment. Now, in the story of Esther, it's an incredible story. There's lots of details. You might be familiar with the story. You might have done Bible studies on it before. If you're interested in Esther, I'd encourage you to do a deep dive into it and look through it. But I think there's a couple lessons that come to the surface when we think about our own faith story and our own journeys and maybe what we're experiencing that really connect with the story we read in Esther. And the first one is this. I think we see this time and time again in the story of Esther, is that God tends to work in unseen ways. Now, there are times in our life where maybe things are very clear, and there's a sign, and God shows up in the Bible and does things that are very clear. He's in a burning bush. He's a booming voice from heaven. There are other times, though, when maybe it's not so clear, that God is working in ways that are unseen, that God is working in ways that are not always so easily to detect. Sometimes it's mysterious. And maybe we can relate to this in our faith journey. There's been moments in our lives when we're looking for answers. We're trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. Where am I supposed to go? God, are you going to give me a sign? And it feels like maybe God's quiet. It Feels like there's some mystery there. The message that Esther is given is, for such a time as this, you've been placed here. This is a providential position given to you in your life to do something. And I wonder sometimes in our lives if those answers that sometimes we're struggling so much with are a little closer and clearer to us than we realize. That God is working with us. That God is telling a story to us through our lives. That God is present with us. Even when we don't fully understand it, he's working in unseen ways. A way that we can pay attention to this in our lives is to develop awareness. Because it's really easy to miss things. It's really easy to get so focused on what's coming up or maybe where we've been that we forget to live fully in the moment that we're in. I love what the Apostle Paul says in the book of Ephesians. He says it this way. He says, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise but as wise, making the most of every opportunity. I don't know about you, but there's been times in my life when I have not made the most of every opportunity. A season, a situation where my focus has been somewhere else outside of where I actually was living in the here and now. God invites us in a journey of faith to trust him as we live daily, to realize he is with us here, that he's often working in unseen ways in our lives. And are we paying attention? Are we listening to that? There's this great story that's told by a guy named Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen is a famous Christian author, theologian, spiritual writer, wrote like 40 books, really, really incredible contribution to Christian spirituality and faith. And he tells a story about visiting Notre Dame, which he was a professor there for a number of years. And as he's at Notre Dame, he's walking with a professor who had been there for a number of years, and this professor begins to complain. And he says to him, for years and years, I used to get so upset at all of the interruptions that would happen during my day because they took me away from my work. I wanted to write, I wanted to study, and all these interruptions always just took away my focus until one day I realized the interruptions were my work. Perspective shift. For such a time as this, in the present, in the moment, God is with us working. What if we pay attention to that, to seek how God might be guiding us and what he might be saying and where he's leading us next? We can find that in our connection with him. I think another point the story of Esther tells us is this, that oftentimes being faithful leads to being courageous. That practicing faith leads to being courageous. Esther understood that she was in this moment in time and the decision was before her. She had to act, and that took some courage. That took a sense of being brave because she knew the outcome wasn't certain. She faced death by going to the king, but she chose to be faithful to what she knew was right and practice courage in that moment. She didn't play it safe. There's been a lot of times in my life when I've played it safe. But safety is not a characteristic of God. Now, God, he redeems us, he restores us, he takes care of us, he provides for us. He's not saying that we need to be reckless in our lives, but active faith isn't just taking the easy way. It's not just taking the path of least resistance. Sometimes it's trusting in God and going places that we wouldn't go and doing things that really cause us to be afraid. It's having courage to face those things. I love how C.S. Lewis describes this dynamic of God's character in a very famous book he wrote, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I've heard that one before, Chronicles of Narnia. And in the story, the children, in the story, they go into Narnia, this magical place, and they're going to meet Aslan, the lion, and he represents God in the story. But they don't know at first that Aslan is a lion. They think he's a man. And I love just the reaction that they have. One of the characters, Susan, she says, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous meeting a lion, right? I mean, who wants to meet a lion? And the response is given to her is safe. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. I love that. I don't think God is necessarily calling us to a life of safety, but a life of trust, a life that requires some daring in our lives. Soren Kierkegaard, philosopher, theologian, he said this, to dare is to lose one's footing momentarily. To not dare, to never dare, is to lose oneself. Esther made a choice in the face of something that was difficult, something that seemed just overwhelming. She had courage to go forward and approach the king. And that moment changed the course of history. Now, in the story of Esther, what happens is that moment that she decides to go to the king and she does this thing that was really scary and intimidating, everything that was planned to happen one way is absolutely reversed in the story. It's really incredible. It's just this incredible story. There's irony, there's twists and turns, but everything that was planned becomes undone. Esther goes to the king. She has courage, and she's very smart. She doesn't go to him and just say, here's what I want you to do, but she invites him to a banquet because the best way to ask someone something is to give them free food. I think that's the message there. She invites him to this banquet. She begins to kind of tell him exactly who she is and her identity. Now, what happens in the story that is my favorite part of the story is that the king, he can't sleep one night, and he has this request that people would come and read him the history of his kingdom. Because when you can't sleep at night, you need to hear something really boring. So that's what he does. Like, here, come read me the history of this kingdom. So it's being read to him, and as the history is being read to him, he realizes that Mordecai saved his life. And for some reason, that just didn't compute, and he didn't understand it. And so he says, what's been done to honor Mordecai? And the response is, nothing. And he says, we have to change this. And this is like the most beautiful, like, ironic, like, reversal thing that happens is he calls Haman into his chambers, Haman the villain, and says, hey, there's a man we need to honor, a man who's great, a man who the city needs to know. And Haman's thinking it's him. And he's like, yeah, we do. And the king says to Haman, what should we do to honor this special man? And Haman's like, we should put him on a horse. We should make a parade for him. People should bow down and just say how great he is. And the king says, I love that idea. It's Mordecai. Can you do it? And Haman now has to be the one to do that. Everything that's planned gets changed. Mordecai doesn't die, but Haman is the one that eventually is destroyed. The Jewish people are not annihilated, but they're allowed to establish themselves and protect themselves. Everything that was destined to go one way changes when Esther steps into the story. She practices faith. You know, I've heard it said that big doors hang on small hinges. I love that insight. That oftentimes those big things that happen are those little moments, those little decisions, that conversation that she had, that willingness to go forward. Even in our own spiritual lives, sometimes we're looking to do those big things for God, and oftentimes God's response is, do that little thing. Connect with me daily. Connect with me in prayer. See how I can use my life to love and serve those around me. Esther's given this incredible choice. She practices courage. She has faith. And I think there's a third and final point that her faith story teaches us, and that's that our story is not just about us. That God has uniquely positioned us in our lives, not just for our own benefit, but for how we might impact those around us. That God wants to partner with us as his people to serve and love the world. Ultimately, Esther realized that decision that was weighing on her, it wasn't just about her. It was about the people that she'd save. And she had to understand that, yeah, she might not make it. She might not survive, but it was worth the risk because it was the right thing to do. And she chose in that moment to have faith, to have courage, to understand that her position that she was given wasn't just about her, but it was about everyone around her. You know, I love this story of Esther because it's challenging and it's difficult. I love that it's in the Bible. There's lots of stories like this. And it's not a perfect story. You know, Esther isn't a perfect person. Mordecai's not a perfect person. There's some questionable morals that happen in the story. There's some revenge that happens, and I'm like, I'm a little uncomfortable with that. But it's a reminder that God works in unseen ways, that God works in our lives in ways that we don't often understand, that he is at work, that he is with us. And I think what the story really does is it causes us to wonder about this God that we serve and this God that we follow that is working things out in ways that we don't always fully understand. To wonder about a God who calls us into that story, who wants to know us in a relationship, who wants to partner with us, that we be part of his plan. To wonder about a God who is good, not a God who's safe, but a God who is good and calls us to live lives of faith in him. You know, Jesus and our New Testament writers, they never mention the story of Esther. Jesus never says, hey, remember that story? The Apostle Paul, when he's writing all his letters to churches, he never says, and think of Esther. We never see that in the New Testament. And yet some of these themes that happen in the life of Esther and her story, I see a lot of these themes happen in the life of Jesus. You know, Jesus talked about how faith is often something that happens in subtle ways. That God's kingdom, his presence on earth, isn't always so overt, but sometimes it happens under the surface. It's working even when we don't fully see it. And Jesus talked about trusting in him and having faith in him. And he called his followers to follow him and to leave what was known and easy and comfortable. He calls Peter out of the boat, calls his followers to take up this new way of living. And constantly Jesus talked about his purpose and his mission wasn't about himself. He said, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. In Luke 19, Jesus says the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. His mission was always outward focused. He came to save us. He came to serve. He came ultimately to give his life. See, the story of Esther is this incredible story within the overarching story of the Bible. A story of God calling someone into a partnership, and a story of God calling someone to do something that was difficult. There's lots of opportunities that come our way in our lives, and sometimes it can be challenging to know what decision do we make, what to do. The story reminds us to have faith that God is with us, that he's calling us forward, that we can trust him. You know, one of the big things in this series that we've been talking about so far is that the journey of faith is never predictable, because life is not predictable. Things happen all the time that we can't be prepared for. We try our best, but we can't control them. And I think we're reminded of this all the time, and sometimes in really painful and sobering and sad ways, sometimes in humorous ways as well. You know, this past weekend I was at a wedding, and it was the first wedding that my wife and my son and I all went together as a family of three. My son is 6 months old, and so we were really excited for this wedding, and some friends of ours are getting married, and so we of course had to dress him up, you know, in a really cute outfit. And I think it's interesting that we dress little baby boys like old men. Like that's kind of like the fashion choice, right? It's like suspenders and a bow tie and like high-waisted shorts, but it's adorable. And so he's like looking all cute, and we get him all dressed up, and we're at this wedding, and things are going great, and we're having an awesome time. And then it gets to the vows, and it gets really quiet. And I'm just looking at my son, and we're holding him. And then what happens is the loudest, the smelliest, the most liquid ever blowout just in the middle of the ceremony. And everyone can know this is happening. And, you know, high-waisted shorts, nothing's holding it in. It's just coming out. And so we're sitting there, and we're like going into emergency mode, and I'm grabbing like, you know, the wedding program, putting it underneath him, and I'm like taking him out. I'm like, proud dad moment. I'm going to go change him. I'm running to the back. And as I'm running to the back and I'm opening up the diaper bag, I remember this conversation that my wife and I had where she said, Stephen, double check to make sure we have wipes in there, you know, just in case. And I didn't check to see if there were wipes. I had to get creative. We came back to the ceremony. He doesn't have those nice fancy clothes anymore. He's just wearing a little onesie with a smile on his face. And we had an amazing time, right? Life's unpredictable. Things happen. Blowouts happen. Dads forget to check the diaper bag. You know, it's a good lesson to learn. We experience that all the time in our lives. We're faced with decisions all the time. What do we do? How do we act? What do we know is the right thing to do? You know, what's interesting about Esther's story, I said this at the very beginning, is that God doesn't speak in the story of Esther. He never tells Esther what to do. Esther, you're in this situation. You obviously know this is what it is. He doesn't give her those kind of instructions or directions. But I think God still speaks in the story. He speaks through Mordecai. He speaks in her own life, in her heart, where she knew that she was in this position for a reason. She realized what it was, to act on behalf of others, to practice faith, to have some courage to do something that was difficult because it was going to result in the saving of many lives. You know, as we're gathered here today and we have a chance to come together, and we're all at different places in our journey with God. Some of us have been following Jesus for a long time. Maybe some of us are new. Maybe some of us are coming back to faith, or we're exploring faith. And the truth is, we might be going through difficult things right now. There might be decisions that we have to make. There might be stressful situations. We might be in a season right now where God feels a little quiet, a little distant. And we're wondering what to do. We're wondering what step to take. And when we encounter those situations, a story like this reminds me that although I don't often see everything, God does. That God is working things out in ways that I don't always understand. And one of the things that Jesus says time and time again about himself is he tells us that we can trust him. We can trust his words. We can trust that he is the path to life. We can trust that he is the best version of life, that he is the one to lead us to the Father. And in those situations when things are confusing and we don't have all the answers, we're not exactly sure what to do, we know ultimately who the answer is. It's Jesus. And he's with us. And he's present. And as we slow down, as we pay attention, as we look at the position we might be in our lives, it gives us confidence. We're not sure what's going to happen, but we trust that God is working in us and through us, and he's leading us. And wherever that might be, God will continue to lead us just as he's done in the past. These stories of faith are reminders that God is active, he's present. He calls us into that relationship to walk with us. He's walked with us so far. He's continued to walk with us and lead us to the future that he's calling us to have. Esther's a great story. It's challenging, but ultimately it reminds me of God's presence and his love and his direction. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your word and the many different kinds of stories that we encounter. The stories that are difficult, the stories that are challenging, the stories that, even though they're from so long ago, they speak to our lives today. God, I pray for everyone in this room, and especially for those who may feel at this time that you're distant, that you're quiet, that we're just wondering where you're at. And I wonder if during those really difficult times, we can be reminded of the truth that the loudest message you ever spoke, the clearest message you ever spoke to us was in your son, Jesus. That it is in him that we have life. That it is in him that we have forgiveness. That it is in him that we have peace. God, help us to hold on to that truth today. We love you so much. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.